September 1st, 1939. At precisely 4:43 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Polish fortifications at Westerplatte, near the free city of Danzig. This single moment shattered the fragile peace of Europe and plunged the world into its second devastating global conflict. The ship had arrived days earlier, disguised as a ceremonial vessel celebrating the anniversary of the German victory at Tannenberg. But hidden below deck, over 200 German Marines prepared for war. As the first shells exploded across the dawn sky, World War II had begun. Within hours, German forces attacked Poland from 3 directions. From the north, Army Group North under Colonel General Fedor von Bock surged from East Prussia and Pomerania. From the south, Army Group South commanded by Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt pushed through Silesia. From Slovakia, smaller German and Slovak units crossed the border. In total, 1.5 million German troops, representing 85% of Germany's entire military force, invaded Poland with devastating coordination. Supporting them were over 1,300 aircraft and more than 2,000 tanks. The question burning across Europe: would Britain and France honor their promise to defend Poland? Adolf Hitler had gambled everything on this invasion. His generals worried the attack was premature, that the Wehrmacht wasn't ready. But Hitler sensed weakness in his enemies. For nearly a year, he had watched European powers appease his every demand. Now he believed they would do nothing while he crushed Poland. Standing before the Reichstag hours after the invasion began, Hitler justified his aggression with a lie about Polish attacks on German territory. The staged incident at Glivitz radio station the night before, where German SS troops dressed as Polish insurgents, provided his manufactured pretext. The Polish people woke to a nightmare. German bombers roared overhead, targeting military installations, communication centers, and railways. The Luftwaffe's objective was clear: destroy Poland's ability to coordinate defense before the ground invasion fully materialized. In Warsaw, over 1.3 million civilians heard air raid sirens for the first time in their lives. But what Hitler didn't anticipate was that this attack would finally force the world's greatest empire to draw a line in the sand. To understand how Europe arrived at this catastrophic moment, we must look back to September 30th, 1938. On that day, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stepped off his airplane at Heston Aerodrome, waving a piece of paper bearing both his signature and Adolf Hitler's. He had just returned from Munich, where he had met with Hitler, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The 4 powers had agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a German-speaking majority, in exchange for Hitler's promise to make no further territorial demands in Europe. Standing outside 10 Downing Street, Chamberlain addressed a crowd of relieved Britons. "My good friends," he proclaimed, "this is the second time in our history that there has come back from Germany to Downing Street peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." The crowd erupted in cheers. After the unimaginable horrors of the Great War just 20 years earlier, Britain desperately wanted to believe that peace was possible. The memory of 700,000 British dead still haunted every family in the nation. But there was one voice shouting above the celebration. Winston Churchill, then a backbench member of Parliament, declared, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Churchill's words proved prophetic. On March 15, 1939, barely 6 months after Munich, Hitler's forces marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement lay in ruins. Hitler's promise was worthless. The occupation of Czechoslovakia finally opened Britain's eyes. The policy of appeasement, built on the optimistic belief that reasonable concessions could satisfy Hitler's demands, had failed spectacularly. Chamberlain had been played for a fool, and now the entire world would pay the price. On March 31, 1939, Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons and made an unprecedented guarantee. If Poland's independence came under threat, Britain would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. France made the same commitment. Hitler had been warned. This was Britain drawing its red line, staking its honor and credibility on defending a nation in Eastern Europe that most Britons couldn't locate on a map. Yet Hitler remained convinced that Britain and France were bluffing. Why would they fight for Poland when they had abandoned Czechoslovakia without firing a shot? Throughout the summer of 1939, Hitler prepared his invasion. German factories worked around the clock producing ammunition, tanks, and aircraft. The Wehrmacht conducted massive training exercises near Poland's borders. European diplomats scrambled to prevent war, but Hitler had already made his decision. On August 23, the world was shocked by the announcement of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies, had agreed not to attack each other. Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow and signed the agreement with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. Secret protocols in the pact revealed something even more sinister. They had agreed to divide Poland between themselves. Stalin would get Eastern Poland and the Baltic states. Hitler would get Western Poland and a free hand to attack France later. This pact stunned the world. Communism and fascism were supposed to be mortal enemies. Now they were allies, dividing Eastern Europe like mafia bosses splitting territory. Britain and France suddenly realized they faced an impossible situation. They had guaranteed Poland's independence, but how could Poland survive if attacked simultaneously from the west and east? Could Poland withstand the combined might of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia? The answer was clear: absolutely not. As August ended, Hitler gave the order. German troops massed on Poland's borders. Tanks rolled into position. Artillery batteries prepared. On the night of August 31st, SS officer Alfred Naujoks led a staged attack on a German radio station in Glivitz, near the Polish border. His team, dressed in Polish uniforms, broadcast anti-German propaganda and left behind the body of Franciszek Honiak, a local farmer sympathetic to Poland, as evidence of Polish aggression. It was all theater, all lies. But it gave Hitler his excuse. Hitler's final orders to his commanders were chilling. The victor will not be asked whether he told the truth. The invasion would begin at dawn. At dawn on September 1st, German forces crashed across Poland's borders like a steel tidal wave. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a revolutionary military strategy combining fast-moving armored units with overwhelming air power to create shock and paralysis in the enemy. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of this strategy, understood that speed and coordination were everything. Don't give the enemy time to think, to regroup, to counterattack. The Polish army, still operating with World War I tactics and equipment, was about to face warfare's terrible future. From the north, General George von Kuckeler's Third Army pushed from East Prussia while General Gunther von Kluge's Fourth Army attacked the Polish Corridor, a strip of territory that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. In the south, three armies advanced: General Johannes Blaskowitz's 8th Army toward Lodz, General Wilhelm List's 14th Army toward Krakow, and General Walter von Reichenau spearheading directly toward Warsaw. The Polish capital stood at the center of Germany's strategic trap. The Polish military was not prepared for this onslaught. Though Poland had approximately 800,000 to 1 million soldiers, mobilization had come too late. Political considerations had forced Poland to deploy its forces too close to the borders, making them vulnerable to encirclement. Poland possessed only about 100 modern tanks compared to Germany's 2,000. The Polish Air Force had roughly 400 aircraft, most outdated, against Germany's 1,300 modern planes. Within 48 hours, the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority. German Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens designed to terrify civilians and soldiers alike. These aircraft attacked railways, bridges, and communication centers. By the end of the first day, Poland's ability to coordinate its defense had been severely compromised. Polish commanders struggled to communicate with their units. Orders took hours or days to reach frontline troops. Some Polish units never received orders at all. Yet the Polish people fought with extraordinary courage. At the Battle of Mokra on September 1st, the Polish Wolinska Cavalry Brigade, armed with anti-tank weapons, successfully halted German tanks, destroying several German armored vehicles. This shattered the myth that Polish cavalry charged German tanks with sabers and lances, a piece of propaganda that would persist for decades. The truth was that Polish soldiers fought intelligently and bravely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting a two-front war even before Soviet forces entered. At Westerplatte, where the war began, a garrison of just 182 Polish soldiers held out against over 3,000 German troops supported by naval bombardment and air attacks. The Polish commander, Major Henryk Sieczarski, had been told to hold for 12 hours. His men held for 7 days, surrendering only on September 7th after their ammunition ran out and their fortifications lay in ruins. Polish resistance surprised the Germans. Wehrmacht commanders had expected to crush Poland in days. Instead, Polish defenders fought for every mile, every town, every bridge. At the Battle of Bazura from September 9 to 19, Polish forces launched the war's largest counterattack, catching German troops off guard and temporarily halting their advance toward Warsaw. By September 6, German forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The city, home to 1.3 million people, prepared for siege. Mayor Stefan Starzyński broadcast daily on the radio, rallying citizens to defend their capital. Men and women built barricades. Children filled sandbags. Everyone did their part. On September 8, German tanks attempted to penetrate Warsaw's defenses but were thrown back with heavy losses. Civilians and soldiers worked together, setting fuel ablaze on roads to destroy German armor. Polish defenders threw Molotov cocktails at advancing panzers. The Germans retreated to regroup. Warsaw would not fall easily. The Battle of Warsaw became a symbol of Polish resistance. For 20 days, from September 8 to 27, the city endured constant bombardment. German artillery pounded the city day and night. The Luftwaffe conducted over 400 bombing raids, dropping 560 tons of high-explosive bombs and 72 tons of incendiary bombs. Whole neighborhoods burned. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Water and food supplies dwindled. Yet Warsaw fought on. But Poland's agony was about to get worse. Much worse. On September 17, 1939, while Polish forces desperately defended against German attacks from the west, a new threat emerged from the east. At dawn, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov summoned Polish Ambassador Wacław Grzybowski to the Kremlin and informed him that the Soviet Union was entering the war. The excuse: Poland had ceased to exist as a state, so Soviet forces were moving in to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities. Over 800,000 Soviet troops poured across Poland's eastern border. The Polish army, already decimated by 3 weeks of fighting Germany, now faced a second massive invasion. Polish forces in the east, totaling perhaps 250,000 men, were positioned to fight Germans from the west. They were utterly unprepared for Soviet attack from behind. Within days, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Polish territory, meeting virtually no organized resistance. Polish commanders faced an impossible dilemma. Should they fight the Soviets? If they did, they would be fighting on two fronts with no hope of victory. Some units chose to fight anyway. At Sak on September 28, Polish cavalry charged Soviet positions in one of history's last great cavalry charges. The Poles were slaughtered. Other Polish units chose to retreat, hoping to reach neutral Romania or Hungary where they might escape and continue fighting. The Soviet invasion sealed Poland's fate. On September 18, Polish President Ignacy Mościcki and Commander-in-Chief Marshal Edward Rydz Śmigły crossed the border into Romania, where they were immediately interned. The Polish government had ceased to exist on Polish soil. But in France and Britain, Polish forces would reorganize and continue fighting for the next 6 years. Warsaw, surrounded and cut off, continued its defiant stand. But by late September, the situation had become hopeless. The city had no water, no electricity, no food. Over 25,000 civilians had been killed in the bombing. German artillery had reduced much of the city to rubble. On September 27, after a final massive bombardment that killed over 1,000 people in a single day, Warsaw's commander, General Walerian Chuma, surrendered. In London, the British government faced its moment of truth. Parliament convened on September 1, hours after the German invasion began. Members of Parliament demanded to know, would Britain honor its commitment to Poland? The mood was tense, almost explosive. Many felt Chamberlain had already betrayed Czechoslovakia. If Britain failed Poland now, what did British promises mean? Chamberlain consulted with his cabinet and with France. Both governments agreed they could not stand by while Hitler destroyed Poland. On September 1, British Ambassador Sir Neville Henderson delivered a warning to the German government: withdraw from Poland or face war. The deadline, September 3 at 9 a.m. Hitler ignored the ultimatum. He didn't believe Britain would actually fight. His contempt for democratic leaders was absolute. They were weak, he thought, obsessed with peace, unwilling to sacrifice their comfortable lives. He had seen them surrender principle after principle. Why would Poland be different? But Hitler had misjudged his enemy. Britain's patience had finally run out. On September 3, 1939, at 11:15 a.m. British summertime, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the British people via BBC radio. His voice was heavy with sadness and resignation. "This morning," he began, "the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that, unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." Across Britain, millions listened to those words with a mixture of dread and determination. They knew what war meant. The generation that fought in World War I still remembered the trenches, the gas attacks, the endless slaughter. Now it was happening again. Chamberlain continued, "You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful." The Prime Minister's voice cracked with emotion. This was the man who had staked his entire political legacy on preventing war through negotiation and compromise. Now he was leading Britain into the greatest conflict in human history. Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland, he said. But Hitler would not have it. He had evidently made up his mind to attack Poland whatever happened. Chamberlain ended with words that would define Britain's war effort. "Now may God bless you all. May He defend the right. It is the evil things that we shall be fighting against, brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression and persecution, and against them I am certain that the right will prevail." Within hours, France also declared war on Germany. Australia, New Zealand, and India quickly followed. The British Empire and its allies were now committed to stopping Hitler. But the question that haunted everyone, could they actually do it? The declaration of war did not immediately help Poland. Britain and France had no way to directly strike at Germany quickly enough to relieve Polish forces. The British army was small, poorly equipped after years of budget cuts. Britain had no significant bomber force capable of reaching German industrial centers. The Royal Navy could blockade Germany, but that would take months or years to have effect. France had a large army, over 5 million men under arms. French forces vastly outnumbered the German troops left defending the western border. Most of Germany's military was in Poland. France could have attacked immediately, potentially reaching the Rhine River before German forces could redeploy. Some historians believe such an attack might have shortened the war by years, saving millions of lives. But France chose caution. French Commander-in-Chief General Maurice Gamelin launched a limited offensive called the Saar Offensive on September 7. French troops advanced about 8 kilometers into German territory, capturing some abandoned villages. Then they stopped and withdrew. France's military doctrine emphasized defense, not offense. The generals remembered the horrific casualties of World War I and refused to risk their soldiers in aggressive attacks. This decision sealed Poland's fate. Hitler had correctly calculated that Britain and France would not effectively intervene in time. On September 17, when Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east, Britain and France did nothing. The Nazi-Soviet Pact made the situation politically complex. How could the Western Allies fight both Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously? So they chose to focus on Germany and pretend the Soviet invasion hadn't happened. This betrayal would poison Polish-Soviet relations for generations. By October 6, 1939, the last organized Polish military units had surrendered. Poland had ceased to exist as an independent nation. Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country according to their secret agreement. Germany annexed the western regions, incorporating them directly into the Reich. Central Poland became the general government, a Nazi-occupied territory ruled by brutal governor Hans Frank. The Soviet Union absorbed eastern Poland into Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Belorussia. The human cost of the invasion was staggering. Polish military casualties numbered approximately 66,000 killed and 133,700 wounded. German casualties were about 16,000 killed, 32,000 wounded, and 3,400 missing. Soviet casualties remain disputed but likely exceeded 3,000 killed. But these military figures pale compared to the civilian suffering that was about to begin. What followed the invasion was one of history's darkest chapters, the systematic destruction of Polish society. Hitler had ordered his forces to show no mercy. He told his commanders on August 22, "The aim of war is not to reach definite lines but to annihilate the enemy physically. It is by this means that we shall obtain the vital living space that we need." This wasn't conquest for territory. This was genocide disguised as military necessity. German Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed Wehrmacht units into Poland. Their mission: eliminate Polish leadership, intellectuals, clergy, and Jews. In Operation AB Action launched in 1940, Germans murdered approximately 7,000 Polish professors, teachers, priests, and political leaders. The goal was to decapitate Polish society, leaving a population of uneducated slaves to work for German masters. The Soviet occupation was equally brutal. Soviet NKVD secret police arrested over 200,000 Polish citizens, deporting them to gulags in Siberia and Kazakhstan. In April and May 1940, on Stalin's personal orders, Soviet executioners murdered approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals in what became known as the Katyn massacre. Soviet forces shot victims in the back of the head and buried them in mass graves. For decades, the Soviet Union blamed Germany for these murders. Only in 1990 did Russia finally admit Soviet guilt. But the greatest horror awaited Poland's Jewish population. Before the war, Poland was home to approximately 3.3 million Jews, the largest Jewish population in Europe. They had lived in Poland for over 800 years, building a rich cultural and religious life. Within 6 years, the Nazis would murder 3 million of them in the Holocaust. Poland would become the primary site of Nazi extermination camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of World War II and the Holocaust. These two catastrophes are inseparable. Hitler's racial ideology drove both. He wanted living space for Germans, which meant removing the people already living there. He wanted to eliminate Jews entirely from Europe. Poland, caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, suffered more than almost any nation. By 1945, Poland would lose approximately 6 million citizens, including 3 million Jews. Nearly 17% of Poland's pre-war population would be dead. After Britain and France declared war on Germany, a strange calm descended on Western Europe. Newspapers called it the Phony War in English, Drôle de guerre, Funny War in French, and Sitzkrieg, Sitting War in German. From September 1939 to May 1940, virtually no fighting occurred on the Western Front despite the official state of war. British troops arrived in France to man defensive positions. The French army remained behind the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications along the German border. Both sides conducted occasional artillery exchanges and patrol skirmishes, but nothing resembling major combat. Soldiers on both sides wondered if this might remain a war of words and threats rather than battles and bloodshed. Some politicians hoped for peace. In October 1939, Hitler offered Britain and France a settlement: accept Germany's conquest of Poland and there would be no war in the West. Chamberlain rejected the offer. Britain's word meant something. The guarantee to Poland had been given, and though Poland now lay crushed, Britain would not make peace with the nation that had destroyed it. But the Phony War created a dangerous illusion in Britain and France. Maybe this war wouldn't be so bad after all. Chamberlain's government struggled with the reality of actually fighting a war. Throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940, Britain ramped up military production and mobilization. Factories that had produced consumer goods switched to making weapons and ammunition. The Royal Air Force expanded rapidly, though it still lagged far behind the Luftwaffe. The Royal Navy began enforcing a blockade of Germany, hoping to strangle Hitler's war machine by cutting off imports. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, many in Chamberlain's own Conservative Party began questioning his leadership. How could the man who had appeased Hitler now lead Britain in total war against him? Chamberlain seemed exhausted, demoralized by the failure of his peace policy. When he appeared before Parliament, he lacked the fire and conviction that wartime leadership demanded. One man did have that fire: Winston Churchill. Chamberlain had appointed Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty when war began, putting him in charge of the Royal Navy. Churchill brought energy, determination, and aggressive spirit to the war effort. While Chamberlain seemed to hope the war might somehow end through negotiation, Churchill understood this was a fight to the death with an evil ideology. Events in Scandinavia would soon give Churchill his chance to replace Chamberlain. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway and Denmark. Britain and France launched an expedition to help Norway but were badly beaten by superior German forces. The Norwegian campaign exposed how unprepared the Allies were for modern warfare. On May 7 and 8, Parliament held a debate on the Norway disaster. Member after member rose to denounce Chamberlain's leadership. Leo Amery, a Conservative MP, quoted Oliver Cromwell's famous dismissal of Parliament: "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." The chamber erupted. Even many Conservatives agreed Chamberlain had to go. On May 10, 1940, Chamberlain resigned. King George VI asked Winston Churchill to form a government. That same day, Hitler launched his invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Phony War was over. The real war, the catastrophic war that would kill tens of millions, had begun. Churchill would lead Britain through its darkest hour. But Chamberlain's role in history was already written. He was the man who had tried to appease Hitler, who had believed peace was possible with a dictator who only understood force. His tragedy was that he learned the truth too late. As he told the British people on September 3, 1939, Hitler would not have it. But what were the consequences of Britain's declaration of war? What did it actually achieve? Britain's decision to honor its guarantee to Poland was one of the most consequential decisions in modern history. Had Britain chosen appeasement again, had Chamberlain said, "Poland is too far away, we cannot help them, we must think of British interests first," the entire course of the 20th century would have been different. If Britain had not declared war, Hitler would have conquered Poland without international opposition. Emboldened, he would have continued his expansion eastward, likely attacking the Soviet Union even earlier. Without Britain fighting Germany, there would have been no Western Front to divide Hitler's attention and resources. The Wehrmacht could have concentrated entirely on defeating the Soviet Union. Would Hitler have won? It's impossible to know. But without British resistance, without British bombers attacking German cities, without British forces tying down German divisions in North Africa and later in France, Hitler would have had overwhelming advantages against Stalin. The Holocaust would have proceeded without any external pressure or awareness. Millions more would have died. Britain's stand also had profound implications for America. When Britain declared war on Germany, the United States remained neutral. But Britain's survival kept alive the possibility of defeating Hitler. When France fell in June 1940 and Britain stood alone, American opinion slowly began to shift. President Franklin Roosevelt started providing Britain with war material even while maintaining official neutrality. Had Britain made peace with Hitler in 1940, as some in Britain advocated, Hitler would have controlled all of Europe from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. No democratic powers would have remained on the European continent. America would have faced a world where totalitarian dictatorships controlled Europe and East Asia, with Japan rampaging through China and Southeast Asia. Britain's declaration of war on September 3, 1939, was the first domino. It led to France declaring war. It kept the flame of resistance alive when continental Europe fell under Nazi occupation. It provided a staging ground for the eventual Allied liberation of Europe. It was, in short, the decision that prevented Hitler from winning. But we must acknowledge the bitter irony. Britain went to war to defend Poland's independence, yet Poland spent 45 years under Soviet domination after the war ended. The Western Allies liberated Western Europe from Nazi tyranny, but Eastern Europe simply traded one totalitarian master for another. Polish soldiers who fought in British uniforms throughout the war were told they couldn't march in the London Victory Parade in 1946 because it might offend Stalin. The Poles have a saying, "Britain gave the guarantee, but Poland got the war." There's truth in that bitter observation. Britain and France declared war too late to save Poland, too early to be truly prepared, and with no real plan to actually help Polish forces. The guarantee was sincere, the intentions were honorable, but the practical result was that Poland was destroyed while its allies watched from the sidelines. Yet without that guarantee, without Britain's willingness to finally say enough to Hitler's aggression, the world would have been plunged even deeper into darkness. Chamberlain's broadcast on September 3, 1939, represented the moment when appeasement died and resistance was born. While Poland lay under occupation, Polish forces continued fighting. The Polish government in exile established itself in London, led first by General Władysław Sikorski and later by Stanisław Wycik. Over 200,000 Polish soldiers made their way to France, Britain, and the Middle East to continue the fight. These men had escaped through Romania, Hungary, and the Baltic states, determined to liberate their homeland. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain in summer 1940, defending British skies against German bombers. Polish squadrons, particularly the famous 303 Squadron, achieved some of the highest kill ratios of any unit. Polish soldiers fought in Italy, at Monte Cassino, where they finally captured the fortress that had stopped Allied advances for months. Polish paratroopers jumped at Arnhem. Polish forces participated in the D-Day landings and the liberation of France. But Poland's greatest tragedy was still to come: Warsaw. In August 1944, as Soviet forces approached Warsaw, the Polish underground resistance launched an uprising against German occupation. The Warsaw Uprising was supposed to last a few days, just long enough for Soviet forces to arrive and help. But Stalin ordered Soviet troops to stop their advance and wait outside Warsaw. For 63 days, Polish resistance fighters battled German forces in the streets of their capital while Soviet forces watched from across the river. Hitler ordered Warsaw's complete destruction. German forces systematically demolished the city, block by block. Special demolition squads used flamethrowers and explosives to destroy what bombs and artillery had missed. By the time the uprising ended on October 2, 1944, approximately 200,000 Polish civilians had been killed. Over 85% of Warsaw's buildings lay in ruins. The city was a wasteland. Stalin's refusal to help the Warsaw Uprising was calculated cruelty. He wanted the Polish resistance destroyed because they were anti-communist and would resist Soviet domination after the war. Better to let the Germans kill them. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in January 1945, they found a city of ghosts and rubble. The Soviets liberated Poland from the Nazis only to impose their own dictatorship. Stalin installed a communist government that took orders from Moscow. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 sealed Poland's fate. Roosevelt and Churchill, desperate to maintain the alliance with Stalin, accepted Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Poland's democratic government in exile in London was abandoned. The country Britain had gone to war to defend became a Soviet satellite state. For 45 years, from 1945 to 1989, Poland lived under communism. Political opposition was crushed. The economy stagnated. Secret police monitored citizens. Censorship controlled all media. This was Poland's reward for being Hitler's first victim, for fighting on the Allied side throughout the war, for never surrendering. The tragedy of Poland's 20th century experience is almost impossible to comprehend. What lessons can we draw from the events of September 1939? What does this history teach us about war, peace, aggression, and how democracies respond to tyranny? First, appeasement of aggressive dictators doesn't work. Chamberlain believed that reasonable concessions would satisfy Hitler's demands and preserve peace. Every concession instead convinced Hitler that Britain and France were weak and wouldn't fight. Appeasement doesn't prevent war. It just postpones it while making the eventual conflict worse because the aggressor has grown stronger. Second, guarantees without the means to enforce them are dangerous. Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence but had no practical way to defend Poland against simultaneous German and Soviet invasion. The guarantee gave Poland false hope and may have made Polish leaders less willing to make concessions that might have delayed war. Empty promises can be worse than no promises at all. Third, democracies are slow to recognize threats from totalitarian regimes. Democratic leaders kept believing Hitler would eventually moderate, that he would be satisfied with limited gains. They projected their own rationality and values onto someone who operated by completely different rules. By the time they understood Hitler's true nature, precious time had been lost. Fourth, military preparedness matters. Britain and France in 1939 were woefully unprepared for war after years of military budget cuts. They faced a German military that had been rearming at massive scale since 1933. The price of peace dividends is unpreparedness when war comes. Had Britain and France maintained stronger militaries in the 1930s, Hitler might have been deterred from aggression entirely. Fifth, geography shapes strategy. Britain and France could not help Poland directly because Germany stood between them and Poland. They could declare war, but they couldn't get their armies to the battlefield quickly enough to matter. This geographic reality meant Poland was doomed from the start, even with British and French guarantees. Sixth, sometimes there are no good options, only terrible choices. Chamberlain faced impossible decisions: accept Hitler's aggression and lose all credibility, or go to war unprepared and risk defeat. Fight for Poland knowing you can't actually save Poland, or abandon Poland and watch Hitler conquer Eastern Europe. In September 1939, there were no good choices left because the good choices had been rejected years earlier. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: when faced with evil, someone must stand up and say no, even if the cost is terrible.